Hi, welcome back, friends. Welcome to Story Time, and I'm the storybook lady, Miss Dusty, and it's time to read Cranberry Thanksgiving by Wendy and Harry Devlin. So, Cranberry Thanksgiving. Have you ever had a cranberry? I like them. They're kind of tart. You have to add a lot of sugar. So you can make a cranberry salad or cranberry dressing at Thanksgiving, cranberry bread. There's a lot of different things, but you always have to add sugar because they're pretty tart. So if you like little things that are a little sweet and sour, sweet and tart, you'd probably like a cranberry. So anyway, back to our story. Maggie darted about like a black-stockinged bird in search of the wood for fireplace. She and her grandmother lived at the edge of a lonely cranberry bog in New England, and the winds were cold at the edge of the sea. So that must be little Maggie right up there. And there's grandmother's house. Today, Mr. Whiskers was helping Maggie with her chores, and they soon had armfuls of wood. "Happy Thanksgiving Day, Mr. Whiskers," Maggie smiled at her friend. That wasn't his real name, of course. It was Uriah Peabody, but Maggie had called him Mr. Whiskers ever since she could remember. Maggie was fond of Mr. Whiskers. Her grandmother was not. "Too many whiskers, not enough soap," she often said to Maggie. And there's Mr. Whiskers with helping Maggie. That's a good friend to help you. "Mr. Whiskers indeed," sniffed Grandmother, peeking from her kitchen window. She pulled the curtains tight again. Whenever Grandmother baked her cranberry bread, she pulled her curtains tight. The reason for this was that her cranberry bread was the most famous for miles around. It was so famous that bakers all over the countryside had offered great sums of money for the recipe. And although Grandmother scoffed at the whole idea, she still felt it was something wonderful to leave to Maggie. She carefully hid the recipe behind a brick in the fireplace. "Oh, a lot of people would like to get that recipe," she fumed to herself, "especially Maggie's clam-digging friend, Mr. Whiskers. Strange how he always showed up when she took down that great yellow bowl and all the good things that went into it." So there's Grandmother sniffing out the window, and there she is getting her secret recipe. That's a nice big fireplace. "Shoo, scat," she would call from the window every time he came too close to the house. But forgot all that today. It was Thanksgiving, her favorite day of the year. The cranberries had been picked and boxed and sent to market. The dried corn had been soaked in the corn pudding made, and the turkey was roasting in the old iron oven. Turnips, tiny green peas, and a pumpkin pie were ready, and the cranberry bread was cooling on the wooden board, and the real work was done, and the feast was almost ready. Every year, Grandmother invited a guest for dinner and allowed Maggie to do the same. "Ask somebody poor or lonely," she always said. It never mattered to Maggie or her grandmother that the red carpet was worn and mended, or that the silver spoons didn't match. Friendship and sharing was important, and everybody knew that. Red-cheeked, Maggie raced into the house, and while she changed, Grandmother excitedly told her whom she had invited. Mr. Horace was his name, and he was staying at the town hotel. So there she is, telling Mr. Whiskers, Mr. Scat. And there they are, coming in and getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner. "He's actually Bowes, and he has a gold cane and smells like lavender," said Grandmother happily. "And he's all alone." Maggie looked a little uncertain. "My guest doesn't smell of lavender," she began, "and he hasn't had a Thanksgiving dinner in 20 years. I invited Mr. Whiskers." "Mr. Whiskers!" Grandma didn't appear to believe she'd heard that right. "You mean here in this house?" But now there was a sound at the door and a loud clanging of the knocker. "Quick, Grandmother, take off your apron." Grandmother opened the door, and there they were, both guests, Mr. Horace, pink-cheeked and starched, and Mr. Whiskers in his old captain's hat. And as soon as they came in, trailing behind them the smell of lavender and an aura of clams and seaweed. So there they are. Oh, they're about as different as you can get, aren't they? And he's got quite the whiskers, doesn't he? That's quite the beard. Mr. Whiskers held up his hands to Grandmother. "Clean?" he said. "Oh, and where's your tie?" Grandmother asked. He lifted his long whiskers. "Right here where it's always been," he growled. Maggie thought she saw a smile behind the whiskers. Said Grandmother, and taking Mr. Horace's arm, she led him into the dining room. "That is quite the beard. Look at that." And there's Mr. Horace, looking all pretty spiffy. A log fire sputtered, and the glasses shone, and certainly no one would notice that the silver spoons didn't match. "Let's sing 'We Gather Together,'" said Maggie, trying to warm things up. And they all joined in the old hymn, and midway began to sing out with cheer and gusto. And Grandmother started to trill like a bird, until Mr. Whiskers fixed her with a quizzical gaze and shook his ears. Look at that. Quite a nice table. How about 16 men on a dead man's chest? He roared, slapping his knee. Mr. Horace looked pained. Grandmother peered over her glasses. Really? She said. Maggie left the table and reappeared with the roast turkey. The corn pudding and peas and cranberry jelly and turnips soon followed. And then came the pale sweet butter and grandmother's famous cranberry bread. Feast of feasts, murmured Mr. Whiskers. Well, we have all heard about your cranberry bread, chuckled Mr. Horace, and the recipe hidden in the kitchen fireplace. It's in the dining room fireplace, said grandmother, and looking over at Mr. Whiskers, she added, and you, sir, will never find it. Mr. Whiskers stared at the turkey and pretended not to have heard her. There they are, ready for Thanksgiving, and she's pretty proud of her recipe, and certain Mr. Whiskers is going to get it. Maggie began to get nervous, but she made sure everyone had served some of each dish, and they began to eat. What a great full dinner that was, with everything cooked with crisp edges and tender centers. How delicious, said Maggie. Quite exquisite, said Mr. Horace. How about some more, said Mr. Whiskers. At last they finished dinner, and Maggie and grandmother cleared the table and went to the kitchen. Watch that Whiskers, fellow, grandmother whispered to Maggie. Maggie opened the kitchen door just a wee small bit and peeked into the dining room, and her eyes widened. Grandmother, he found it. Uh-oh. Somebody found the recipe, that Mr. Whiskers. Crash, clumpity, there was a sound of wild shuffling and loud shouts and falling chairs, and two figures pushed to the front door. For a moment they wrestled at the doorway, and then they seemed to burst into the purple dark. One chased the other into the cranberry bog. Uh-oh, goodness sakes, what's going on? Did that Mr. Whiskers take the recipe? The nerve of him stealing our recipe, grandmother said with fire in her eye. Maggie knew who she meant. It wasn't Mr. Whiskers. It was Mr. Horace. Mr. Horace, grandmother looked shocked, but why? Because he owns a bakery in the city. And Mr. Whiskers knew this, grandma asked. Yes, said Maggie. Mr. Whiskers kindly came today to watch Mr. Horace and to have dinner. Mr. Whiskers came puffing up to the door, holding Mr. Horace by the collar. Proudly he held the recipe high in the other hand. Don't trust a man just because he smells of lavender and has a gold cane, he growled. Goodness gracious. So it wasn't the Mr. Whiskers after all. Grandmother stood up very straight and looked at Mr. Horace. You, sir, are a disgrace. He is worse than that, said Mr. Whiskers. He's a recipe robber, said Maggie, and all the starch seemed to have left Mr. Horace. No pumpkin pie for you, sir. Grandmother handed him his cane. Mr. Horace began to sniffle, and they left Mr. Horace on the doorstep. Grandmother closed the door firmly, and this time she took Mr. Whiskers' arm into the dining room, and Maggie thought she could see Mr. Whiskers smile. He's been roundly refused, Mr. Horace. They sat by the warm embers of the fire and ate pumpkin pie with whipped cream. How delicious, said Maggie. How delightful, said grandmother. How about another piece, said Mr. Whiskers. The wind blew and rattled the shutters, and outside came a loud wail from Mr. Horace. That does look cozy. Goodness, is he still there, said Maggie. Shall we let him in? It's Thanksgiving, said grandmother. It's especially Thanksgiving on Cranberry Farm, Maggie replied encouragingly, and they looked at Mr. Whiskers. It took great effort on Mr. Whiskers' part, but with true character he stood up and said, Maggie, open the door and we shall give him the last piece. That's true Thanksgiving spirit. How about 16 men on a dead man's chest? Grandmother asked him while Maggie went to the door, and even Mr. Whiskers couldn't hide that smile. And would you look at that? There's grandmother's recipe for her famous cranberry bread. How about that? So there you go, a cranberry Thanksgiving. So maybe this Thanksgiving you can try some cranberry sauce or cranberry salad or maybe a cranberry bread. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the story and I hope you have a wonderful day.